Hi everybody, thanks for coming. My name's Declan Spring. I work at New Directions. I was the editor of the book, QUIERE, or Centennial edition. I worked on it with Jonathan. And thank you all for coming. One thing that struck me working on this book is that it was written at a time in Williams's career when he was really pulled pretty intensely in two directions. One, he was seeking a wide reading public, but he was also drawn toward these smaller, eccentric avant-garde circles. At the time, 1917, when the book was written and published, modernist writers and artists were going over to Europe, and he was quite isolated, living in New Jersey. It was when James Laughlin and New Directions published Williams in the late 30s and the 40s that Williams started to find his readership. We've now published over 30 works of Williams that are all available and are still in print. Currently, New Directions publishes over 30 new books a year of many interesting experimental writers around the world. But WCW, along with H.D., Ezra Pound, and Tennessee Williams, is a bedrock author of our press. James Laughlin, our founder, once described Williams as the cornerstone of New Directions, and we're really thrilled to have brought out the Centennial edition of QUIERE, which was never published as an individual volume by New Directions, so it's about time. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the three people who will be speaking with you tonight. First, John Cohen, who's the editor of the book. He's an award-winning translator of Latin American poetry. He's translated Ernesto Cardenal, Enrique Lin, Pedro Mir, and Roque Dalton, among others. His own poems and essays have appeared widely. In 2011, New Directions published his By Word of Mouth, an anthology of William Carlos Williams's Spanish translations. And he has also edited a forthcoming Golden Age novella that Williams translated, The Dog and the Fever by Pedro Espinosa, which will be coming out with Wesleyan. After John will be Mónica. You're going second, right?
Yes.
Will be Mónica de la Torre, who will be reading some of the poems from the book and commenting on them. Mónica is a widely admired and published poet, translator, and scholar. Her wonderful latest full-length book of poetry is called The Happy End, All Welcome, which came out this year with Ugly Duckling Press. She's co-edited several multilingual anthologies, and she teaches in the Creative Writing MFA program at Columbia, and is a senior editor at Bomb Magazine. And then finishing the program will be Julio Marzán, and he will talk about Williams and his Spanish background. He has published 2 books of poetry, as well as a book of translations of Luis Pales Matos. He's written 2 novellas and is author of the landmark The Spanish-American Roots of William Carlos Williams, which was published by University of Texas Press in 1994. So please welcome John Cohen. He's going to start things off, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you very much, Declan, and thank you one and all for coming. Special thanks to the Cervantes Institute for hosting our program tonight to celebrate William Carlos Williams' QUIERE. I'm going to provide some context of the book and also focus on the book's epigraph that is in Spanish only, which is a key to the book. And so, first, to show you William Carlos Williams in 1917 at the age of 34. This is the original edition, published by Four Seas Press, a Boston publisher, in November 1917. It was Williams' third book. The first published in 1909, the second in 1913. But the early books were Williams' attempt to sound like John Keats. And in this book, he is finding his voice and establishing the voice that we call Williams. The original edition was more of a yellowish in color. And over time, you can see it has changed. This is the famous letter that Williams wrote to poet Marion Moore in February 1917. He had thought of calling the book Pagan Promises, but he's running his title Al-Qayqiyari by Marion Moore. And you can see the bottom half of the letter is quite well published, and you can see he explains what it means to him who wants it. And as he says, I like the Spanish just like a Chinese image cut out of stone. What's not seen is the top part of the letter. And what's interesting about it, as he talks to more about who he is, you see, he says, I am a mixture of two bloods. And this is an early demonstration of Williams' identity as a Hispanic and American at once, a dynamic that was central to his career as a poet. So this is what's happening in the world in 1917, in February, when he wrote that letter. It's a world at war. It's ironic that here we are on December 7th on Pearl Harbor Day, talking about a book that was published during the war to end all war. And when the book was finally published in November, it's a world at war. Williams is living in Rutherford, where he was born, raised, came back from college, medical school, came back in 1910 from his pediatric fellowship in Germany, and he starts a practice there, his practice of medicine. This is Rutherford when Williams was 21 in 1904. But you can see this is the Williams who is got a practice in his house on Ridge Road in Rutherford, and you can see his hours. He's not a luxury physician, he's out making house calls. And those his two boys. Now the cover of the original edition had a book jacket that was telling readers not to buy this book. That it's crude, and that it will disturb the gentle reader, and that it only costs $1 so that not much can be made of it anyway. But at the same time, what I love about this cover is this prophecy at the bottom of it. Prophecies like this about fame in the future are not uncommon. But what is not common is when they come true. And in Williams' case, they did come true. And his book and his poetry is mined by the poets of today, as the poets of his day looked at at Walt Whitman. So the book itself. So the title of it, it's interesting. It's known as Al-Qayqiyari, but the full title is A Book of Poems Al-Qayqiyari. It's a bilingual title. It's a book of poems to whoever might want it. So this book contains 52 poems. The Wanderer, the Closer, is an early poem published a few years previously. But all the other poems, the 51 other poems, are a very modernist style of what we call free verse. And this is the curiosity, this epigraph, in Spanish only. I don't know what readers would make of it. in 1917. So to open this up, first I want to tell you about the author, Rafael Arevalo Martinez. This is Arevalo Martinez in 1917. He, a year younger than William Carlos Williams. He's not much discussed as a writer nowadays, but he is still considered important because of his short stories, one in particular. And that one in particular is El hombre que parecía un caballo, the man who looks like or resembles a horse. And this short story is the source of the epigraph. He called it a psychozoological story. He wrote a few others in the same style. And this short story, published in 1915, is a precursor of what is called magical realism, because it is fantastic realism. It is a caricature of a friend of Arevalo Martinez. This man who looks like a horse. A famous poet from Colombia, Barba Jacob. Also, he was upfront with his gayness, and the story itself, which is included in our Centennial edition, has a clear homoerotic dimension. But they were good friends. And the man who resembles a horse. Just to put this in context, how Williams encountered this story, how it came to Williams, it's important to appreciate that during the First World War years, there was a robust Pan-American movement, and it was very active in New York City. This monthly magazine was published in New York City since 1900. And it's in this atmosphere when New York was attracting writers from the American tropics. It was in fact the center of the American tropics during the First World War years, with the U.S. occupation in Nicaragua, with the U.S. occupation in the Dominican Republic, with the Mexican Revolution that had been raging for several years, getting a constitution in early 1917. But writers and political radicals of all stripes were coming to New York City. So there was very much a scene of Latin American poets at the time in New York. And this is what motivated Williams to publish with others a monthly poetry magazine, a special edition, the Spanish-American number that came out in August 1916. It was a manifesto with a big dream, as per manifestos, about translating, having relationships with Latin American publications and mutual translations. That never happened. But what did happen was Williams engaged with the poetry of Rafael Arevalo Martinez. And this is a sample translation that I want to show you because of the beautiful imagery that is very much an American form of the French symbolism that Latin American poets of the school called Modernismo were doing. This kind of imagery, as in the second stanza, I folded my heart like a handkerchief, and after I turned the key on my existence. And you can see that this is actually a very literal translation, but it's doing something similar to what Williams and his friends, modernist friends, were doing. They were not capitalizing the first letters of each line of the poems. This at the time was radical. They were not rhyming. And so Williams and his father translated the short story, The Man Who Resembled a Horse. And Williams published it in December 1918, a year after QUIERE appeared. And this is Williams' translation of the epigraph. I had been an adventurous shrub which prolongs its filaments until it finds the necessary humus in new earth. And how I fed. and the lines that follow are absolutely gorgeous and very poetic. But it's the opening two sentences that are central to the epigraph and are key to QUIERE. So what is this new earth that Williams is talking about? Well, in 1915 he met a poet named Alfred Kremborg, and Kremborg was starting this magazine July 1915. It ran for 4 years, and Williams was sustained as a poet by his relationship with Kremborg and the other poets and artists who were associated with this magazine. You'll see on the bottom it says Grantwood, New Jersey. I'll explain in a moment. You'll see the motto of others. The old expressions are with us always, and there are always others. So this is April 1916, a photograph taken at the home of William Carlos Williams in Rutherford. And you can see there are poets and painters here. In the back row, from the left, Jean Croty, Marcel Duchamp, Walter Arensberg, the art dealer, and a poet as well. Man Ray, who at the time was painting, not yet into photography. Far right, Maxwell Bodenheim, the legendary Greenwich Village poet. And you see William sitting down with his cat Mujer. And there's a poem to Mujer in QUIERE. And these are partners and friends and supporters. And you can see Floss Williams is 1, 2, 3, 4th from the left. That tall gal in the back was a very famous dancer. And with the fur, Walter Arensberg's wife. That money helped support the magazine from the Arensberg family. So, Grantwood, New Jersey. It was about 12 miles from Rutherford, and William spent a lot of time there, in poetry groups, reading poems, reviewing submissions for the magazine. Williams became an editor. This is a painting of Grantwood by Man Ray. And it's right on the Palisade. If you looked east, you would see Grant's tomb. And that's how the name Grantwood was derived, from Grant's tomb. Man Ray probably would have seen it this way. So Williams was feeding on modernity and the experimentation of it. And also the new poetry, the new poetics being developed. Poetry magazine is just a few months old in March 1913, when in this issue, Ezra Pound publishes his essay, A Few Don'ts, by an imagist. And I've called most of the don'ts, and you can see the kind of proscriptions he's articulating. But these don'ts are guidelines for a modernist kind of poetry. More don'ts. But many of these don'ts can be, are articulated in these 3 simple rules that Pound references in this issue of poetry. And this was very influential to Williams. And these directives helped him to find his voice and to break away from meter, from English poetics. So, another influence, another aspect of the new earth that nourished Williams, is the work of the painters. This was the button for the Armory show that took place also in March 1913. And here is Marcel Duchamp's famous Nude Descending a Staircase. It's a Cubist masterpiece. And Williams experimented with Cubism, and we find this in his poem in QUIERE, the poem called January Morning, where he has a sequence of 15 different images, 15 different ways to look at a January morning. And this is another artist who was part of the circle, Francois Picabia, and you can see how New York press was paying attention. It was also the kind of art that was shocking a lot of the American realists, of course. So let's go to the apartment of the Ahrensbergs on West 74th Street. 2 floors, spacious. Marcel Duchamp actually was living there for a while and had a studio space. And Williams went there for gatherings. So between his home in Rutherford, his wife and his 2 kids, his practice, his identity as Doc Williams, and then he's in Manhattan at a home like this. And you can see the art on the walls. And you can actually see the new descending staircase, which Ahrensberg had purchased. So Williams is encountering modernity. At the same time, he is exploring the modernity he found in the Baroque Spanish literature. And at this time, in the years before QUIERE, Williams is struggling to produce a translation of Lope de Vega's play, The New World, discovered by Christopher Columbus. The manuscript, if it exists, has not yet been found. So Williams was a Lopista, to be sure. And he's finding, as I say, a modern language, a modern way to write in the poetry of the 1500s and 1600s. And he has commented that what attracted him to Lope de Vega's verse play is the swiftness of the lines. That it wasn't a blank verse. It wasn't restricted to iambic pentameter. And here is a section from this play in my translation, just to show you on the right the kinds of lines that are short and swift. When Williams got back from his fellowship training in Germany and started to set up his practice in Rutherford, he started translating Spanish poetry. And you could see in this letter he wrote to his brother Edgar that he's starting translation. He's working on a contemporary of Shakespeare's, and that Pound is guiding him, saying no kind of practice is better than just such translating work. And this book also, a collection, an anthology from 1807, that Pound left with Williams in the early part of the century, and Pound, who, though he was a Lope de Vega scholar, turned his back on Lope de Vega, and later went on to say things like, Europe ends at the Pyrenees. Years later, however, though, visiting the Williams house, Pound grabbed the book and scribbled a little note to basically return this book one day on loan. So in Williams' autobiography, he focuses on the Spanish, and he talks about what attracted him to it, and how it provides opportunities to make new appraisals and to find, to make it new, to quote Pound, and also the kinds of opportunities specifically in diction, in forms, and discovering new forms. Williams was always looking for what he called, starting with QUIERE, a form that would not deform the language. And again, Ezra Pound, the month of the publication of QUIERE, is encouraging his friend Williams, you know, telling him it's a good thing he has a Spanish blood, and that opacity is not an American quality. And so to summarize, this is my equation of what Tierra Nueva, New Earth, is for Williams, as demonstrated in QUIERE. It is the modernism. In poetry, it is imagism. And in art, also cubism and futurism that stimulated him. And also the symbolism of the contemporary Latin American poets that he absorbed through his work as a translator of these poets. And then the proto-modern that he found in the Baroque Spanish literature, in the poetry and in the plays of Lope de Vega, in particular the play about the New World. So, when you take these elements of New Earth and you address them, you multiply them by W. Carlos Williams, mixture of two bloods, as he says explains to Marion Moore, and plus Williams' commitment to American language and place. And in this regard, Williams was very much listening to and responding to Walt Whitman. So, locality, New Jersey, and we're back in Rutherford, which was Williams' world, the center of his world, and Patterson down the road, but it was home to him where he lived and worked, where he knew people, where he saw the red wheelbarrow at a friend's house, where he discovered his language and his commitment to it. And this is Park Avenue in Rutherford, New Jersey, November 1917, a parade. The U.S. entered the First World War in April 1917, and here you see soldiers marching off to the war. Park Avenue, William Carlos Williams, 1917. And so we have QUIERE. And I would like to close, well, I want to read a short poem. It resonated with Williams. I wanted it to resonate for you. The statement of his. And so I'm going to read the closing section of January Morning, which is something of a poetics. He addresses it to an old woman who happens to be his mother, who rather rejected his modernist poetry. All this was for you, old woman. I wanted to write a poem that you would understand. For what good is it to me if you can't understand it? But you gotta try hard. But, well, you know how the young girls run giggling on Park Avenue after dark when they ought to be home in bed? Well, that's the way it is with me, somehow. Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask Mónica de la Torre to come to the stage. Thank you.
Hello. It's really a treat to be here. Thinking about William Carlos Williams. And this book, QUIERE. So I'm going to read you some of the works, and I'm also reading you some brief reflections on some issues that I found very interesting to me personally. I'm going to time myself so that I don't go over. Okay. And I'll begin at the beginning with that which announces that something new is about to begin. The peculiar title of the collection, whose oddity strikes me, both in relation to the English in which the poems are written and in relation to the Spanish, summoned throughout the collection as shadow language, as hint that some of the poem's sources and as marker of the private realm of the poet's readings and familial conversations. Apropos of the collection's enigmatic title, in the essay accompanying the poems in QUIERE, I wanted to write a poem. Williams writes the following, and I'm going to read it to you. My translation of the phrase QUIERE is to him who wants it. and I have always associated it with a figure on a soccer field, to him who wants the ball to be passed to him. Moreover, I associate it with a particular boy older than myself, at school with me in 1898 at Chateau de Lancy near Geneva, Switzerland. He was a fine soccer player, and he took me under his wing, got me on the varsity team. His name was Suarez, a Spaniard, and as I was half Spanish, there was a bond. He gave me his school cap when he left, a great honor. The phrase made me think of him wanting the ball on the soccer field, and of myself. I was convinced nobody in the world of poetry wanted me, but I was there willing to pass the ball if anyone did want it. End quote. I'm struck by the generosity of the title's dedication. The book is meant, or the book of poems really, because as John reminded us, it's a dual title. The book of poems is meant for the reader who desires. Desires what is a question. Felicitously, in my view, the slightly awkward and not quite colloquial al que quiere means much more than to him who wants it. Had Williams not informed us of the phrase's associations, I would have always read the title as meaning to him who loves, or to him who wants, with the emphasis on the condition of wanting and the what, a person, thing, or situation, remaining evocatively indeterminate. And speaking of moods, in Williams's constructions, and I'm going to get really technical here, so bear with me, the verb querer is not in the subjunctive, but rather in the indicative, and therefore does not posit a hypothetical subject or situation in which a subject wants either person, thing, or situation. Forgive the technicalities, but instead, the use of the indicative in Williams's phrase, despite his conviction that nobody in the world of poetry wanted him, already implies that unspecified someone's want. In other words, if the verb's conjugation in the title's collection indeed matched Williams's intentions, it would have to be al que quiera, no al que quiere, since the reader who might be ready for what Williams has to offer is, before the book's actual encounter with the readership, only speculative, a hypothetical figure. In the subjunctive, the title captures the book as object's miraculous potential to establish a bond with the reader. And yet, after this hopefully not too granular analysis, I do wonder, however, if the joke isn't on me. Perhaps the indicative mood in the title assumes that whomever holds the book already desires to receive its offerings, that the book's potential to be received is being actualized as the reader holds it in his or her hands, and I say his or her hands because the language of the title put Williams in a predicament. He had to choose the gender of the recipient of his dedication, and given his soccer associations, it makes sense that he went for a he. And yet, I read al que quiere as pointing already to a new, hybrid, distinctly American option, with its defiance of Spanish language purists who might have frowned upon his dropping of the opening exclamation mark. You can see, al que quiere, the opening exclamation mark is missing. In this regard, Williams was also anticipatory. In social media, rarely do Spanish language users use opening exclamation and question marks, and something tells me they eventually might go the way of the dodo. We know from the letter that Williams sent Marion Moore, which John kindly showed us, apropos the book's title, that he had mixed feelings about it for not finding it democratic enough, referring to her as, oh, leading light of the sex of the future. He thought she could settle the matter in 2 winks. I wonder what she thought about the title, and if she found the gender issue problematic. Speaking from the future, I'd like to make a suggestion for him. Dr. Williams, respectfully, how about the more inclusive a quien quiera, or a quien quiere? That solves the gender issue. Number 2. We've been talking about the effects of leaving the title of the collection in Spanish. I'd now like to read you some of Williams's translations so we can venture some ideas about how translation might have helped Williams develop technique. That's a phrase that Pound used when recommending that he translate. I'm afraid that I lack the background to understand why Williams chose to translate Rafael Arevalo Martinez's story, The Man Who Resembled a Horse, with, of all people, his father, William George Williams. From this story with rather explicit homoerotic undertones comes Al que quiere's epigraph, as we know already, which Williams curiously leaves in Spanish. The Williams' translation of Arévalo Martínez's psychozoological narrative is included in the Centennial edition that we're celebrating here today, and recounts the effects that a mysteriously equine, highly immoral man have on the story's narrator, whom upon laying eyes on said man in an apartment that later morphs into a hotel, produces the following account. So I read a little quote from the story. In this very first scene of our introduction, Señor de Aretal began by way of welcome to exhibit the translucent strings of opals, amethysts, emeralds, and carbuncles which constituted his intimate treasure. In a first moment of dazzlement, I spread myself out. I opened myself completely like a great white sheet, in order to make greater my surface of contact with the generous giver. End of quote. Arévalo Martínez was also a poet, and Williams had included a sample of his poems in the August 1916 Spanish-American issue of Others, a magazine of new verse, which you saw the cover of. So I'm going to read you just a couple of the poems and Williams' translations. So here's the Spanish of Sensación de un olor. Oh, de los rostros sabios que he llevado a mis labios como vinos traidores. Las mujeres sencillas que senté en mis rodillas como ramos de flores. Y sobre todo una de cabellera bruna, que parecía flor y que dejó en mi vida la vaga, la diluida sensación de un olor. Sus ojos de diamante tenían la inquietante mirada del no ser, y me dio la más fuerte sensación de la muerte que me dio una mujer, y la más encendida sensación de la vida que he podido tener. So this poem, in Williams's version, becomes the sensation of a smell. Oh, the wise faces I have carried to my lips like treacherous wines. The simple women I have seated on my knees like branches of flowers. And above all one with brown hair who resembled a flower and who left in my life the vague sensation of a smell. Her diamond eyes had the disquieting look of non-existence, and she gave me the strongest sensation of death I have had of a woman, and the most burning sense of life that I have been able to obtain. So no rhyme there. And then that same Spanish-American issue of Others has this very interesting poem by Arévalo Martínez, very different from the one we just heard. Yeah, I'll read you Williams's version first. The contemporary Sancho Panza. Today Sancho cloaks himself in various disguises. Sancho Panza criticizes, Sancho Panza writes verses. His bearing is the domine and his speech dogmatic. From the two crutches hang his great plethoric paunch. He has the puerilities of grammar and loves the adolescence of rhetoric. If modernist clothes dress the ideal, in he thrusts his grammatical incisive. He writes the classic sonnet, turns to the estrambote and laughs in his sleeve at Don Quixote. And the sad and curious thing is that the insane Don Quixote opens a new trail into unknown lands, and when it is beaten by him, comfortably passes the bell-shaped figure of his squire. He has left his ass, he wears fine clothes, and shouts in a loud voice at inns and upon highways, "Praise with me all those who renew the tongue. I open new pathways for the young." Never could I tell by what strange accordances behind a madman always walk 100 sane ones. Sancho, good Sancho, I admire your rustic prudence, and I cannot deny that you have in abundance a sense of life which laughs at madness, and which is of 100,000 Sanchos the common sense. Complete to its very full, your derision laughs at the adventures of knighthood, but when peace comes after the battle, you listen to the rebukes of your master and are silent. For the ballmen, life is forever lovely, since if it slopes, they know how to roll down it. O rotund squire of easy soul and broad face, without Don Quixano the Good, what would become of Sancho? Your master misses 100 times, but once he hits, and this old time is worth more than your dead life. In opening to the mind a sealed path, thus history combines the divine pair. In front, the thin master dragging his squire, and behind, the fat servant laughing, but he comes. So I won't read you the whole poem in Spanish, but so in this one, Williams is rhyming sometimes when he can, but he's not really disfiguring or deforming the language to make the pattern of Arévalo Martínez come across. I'll just read you the first part of the original. Sancho Panza contemporáneo. Hoy Sancho Panza se disfraza con disfraces diversos. Sancho Panza hace crítica, Sancho Panza hace versos. Su apostura es de domine, su locución dogmática. De dos muletas cuelga su gran panza pletórica. Infantilidades tiende a la gramática y las adolescencias ama de la retórica. Si ropas modernistas viste al ideal, el inca su incisivo gramatical. And so on. So it's very sing-songy, which you might have noticed. And this sing-song quality, of course, is bestowed on poems by their rhyming patterns that are missing in the English translations. To some, the disregard for rhyme on the translator's part might be the marker of a suboptimal translation job. To my ear, however, the English poems sound almost better than these Spanish originals, since the language becomes unburdened from the shackles of a traditional prosody, and image is allowed to take precedence. This allows Williams to enact the very deliberate turn away from the romantic that he had been rehearsing elsewhere, and besides making the English new by bringing into it new sources of imagery and narratives, also manifests the process by which Williams struggled to get a form without deforming the language, as I already said. And the last observation. Now I want to read you the 3 poems out in the whole collection that have Spanish titles that only obliquely relate to their contents. These are among the briefest in El que quiere. 2 of them, El hombre and mujer, point to things elemental, to the male artist's heroicism in the first case, and woman's animal, I would say, reproductive role in the second. In that, they could be said to make a not entirely unconventional pairing perpetuating certain cultural stereotypes, despite the fact that the first alludes to Góngora, he was the man for Williams, and the second to the poet's cat, Mother Kitty. Now, very interesting. I thought the cat's name was Mother Kitty, but in the images you showed, it said that the cat was named Mujer. So that kind of explains the poem, but I will just proceed to read, regardless. So, El hombre. It's a strange courage you give me, ancient star. Shine alone in the sunrise, towards which you lend no part. Mujer. O black Persian cat, was not your life already cursed with offspring? We took you for rest to that old Yankee farm, so lonely and with so many field mice in the long grass. And you returned to us in this condition, O black Persian cat. Now I'll read you what he writes about this poem. He says, our wonderful Mother Kitty. See, here he refers to her as Mother Kitty. Our wonderful Mother Kitty. We had her 12 years, and when she was ready to die, she just quietly went down in the cellar and lay on her side. She was beautiful, so beautiful, we decided once to mate her with a thoroughbred. There was a $10 male and a $20 male. We thought we could afford the $10 male, but they called us up and said that Mother Kitty would have nothing to do with him. Tore him to pieces. She accepted the $20 male and proceeded to produce just one lone kitten. My, what spirit. The closing lines in the poem will tell you our constant Mother Kitty predicament, and you return to us in this condition. And the last poem I will read you from El que quiere is a poem that he doesn't comment on in the essay, in the collection. And it's called Libertad, Igualdad, Fraternidad. And again, exclamation point at the end of each one, but no opening exclamation point. You sullen pig of a man, you forced me into the mud with your stinking ash cart. Brother, if we were rich, we'd stick our chests out and hold our heads high. It is dreams that have destroyed us. There is no more pride in horses or in rein holding. We sit hunched together, brooding our fate. Well, all things turn bitter in the end, whether you choose the right or the left way. And dreams are not a bad thing. I invite you to ponder the relationship between Arévalo Martínez Sancho Panza's poem and Williams's Igualdad, Libertad, Fraternidad, which very well might be a poem in which Williams disguises himself as Sancho Panza. I'm really not sure about this, I'm just venturing this. But he does seem to adopt his voice and at the same time performs his awareness of the lineage that he seeks to bridge with his modernist own in a radical embrace of the capaciousness of the Americas. I am left wondering about the Spanish titles of the poems, a gesture both opaque and transparent in terms of the relationship to the language spoken at home, a performance of heritage, and a celebration of diversity. I hope I can discuss the matter with my other illustrious panelists here tonight who have devoted much more of their research to the subject than I have. Thank you very much.
It was great to have Jonathan's presentation and Monica's interpretation, because it's kind of what I do requires my alluding to stuff. I don't have enough time to quote it all, but he already did, so it's good for me. I'm going to try to trace how Williams got to the Instituto Cervantes from my textbooks in college. So I can't quite see this up here. Whitman bluntly lectured that to have great poets, there must be great audiences, meaning audiences educated to identify greatness in poetry. To fully appreciate Williams' work, those audiences must also possess a genuinely American consciousness. For Williams, traditional America was not American enough, lacking what he called the quintessentially American, quote, mingling spirit, unquote, which he interpreted as historically first sown in his mother's Caribbean. Traditional U.S. America mythologized its birth in the Puritans. For Williams, the Puritans had, quote, nothing to do with America, unquote. They didn't come to touch, lay hands on the Indian in baptism, what Catholicism set out to do. Williams indeed romanticized a brutal Spanish conquest, focusing on a consequence that, if not redeeming, is nevertheless the history that we inherit. At their best, the Spanish came to, quote, marry America, unquote, in sexually and spiritually wedding its native. Williams' family, I should hasten to add, was Unitarian. This distinction between Anglo-Protestant and Catholic Americas and its treatment of Native Americans, Williams discusses in his classic prose work In the American Grain, published in 1925. That was 27 years before Frank Tannenbaum wrote his classic Slave and Citizen, the Negro in the Americas, invoking the same distinction, an Anglo-Protestant litigation of the humanity of Africans, in contrast to Catholic America, for which, trapped in a lowly social status, slaves were still humans with souls and fundamental rights. Escaped slaves fled to Catholic Louisiana and Florida. Williams envisioned in the American beginning a multicultural future. Patently, he was a poet for our time. But that Williams was not the poet I first read in college. The author of This Is Just to Say, So Much Depends, Asphodel, That Greeny Flower, whom I learned changed American poetry, but with no backstory that would, in retrospect, foreshadow a future multicultural consciousness. Williams was so good at being the modernist poet that, despite his going on with all that Spanish stuff, the criticism, as Auden wrote of William Butler Yeats, pardoned him for writing well. But to properly fit him in his textbook niche, he had to be retro-written, so his readers never connected his work to his potentially foreignizing real life. In 1981, Paul Mariani published William Carlos Williams' A New World Naked, which presented the most complete, sharper image of Williams' family background, his Francophile mother from Puerto Rico, his English-born, Caribbean-raised Hispanophile father, a sometimes French, but a mainly English and Spanish-speaking household, presenting evidence, but not stressing, that Williams grew up bicultural. Still, there remained a gap between the work and the direct influence of that life as portrayed. To make that connection, I wrote The Spanish-American Roots of William Carlos Williams, foremost as poet, claiming him as antecedent, and therefore also to correct the misconception that emergent Hispanic-American writing was like Oscar Wilde's Jack, found in a leather bag in Victoria Station, only appearing to lack a pedigree. I didn't have to unearth anything unknown. Williams had said it all himself throughout his career. Read without ethnocentric filters, his words began to mean much more than they appeared to say, often encoded in order to survive American ethnocentric idiosyncrasies. I did, however, proceed tentatively, hitting road bumps of second thoughts. A history of critical writings contradicted me. My primary source was Williams' own words, so how was it possible that in all those decades nobody read them as I was doing it? For this launch, I reread Al que Quiere, and everything I had once interpreted with caution now seemed intuitive and transparent. I was also reminded of the trajectory of how this Williams finally came to join us in the Instituto Cervantes, since the first time I learned how high was the literary barrier before me. My research done, I had recently started writing in earnest when a graduate school classmate whom my then wife had befriended invited us to dine with her and her husband, the editor of a major National Book Award newsletter. After dinner, he asked to know more about my in-progress book, and as I spoke, his attention appeared to fade in a maelstrom of boredom. Actually, he had been processing my every word and interrupted me with this warning: they will never forgive you for this. The published book, like all books, became many books, including editions from the mouths of those who never actually read it. Camps of Williams critics squared off, supporters and deniers, mainly of what was assumed that I predictably said. In the deniers' camp, the Williams being celebrated tonight simply doesn't exist, nor does my book in any of its bibliographies. The supporting camp became a sandbox of discussion on race and ethnicity, on my being politically correct or not politically correct enough, on my being maybe ethnically obsessed. Spanish literature's influence on Williams was acceptable because reinforced by Williams' own words. But my deciphering on the same intellectual footing that he tacitly appreciated that his literary heritage was also specifically Puerto Rican appeared to detract from my objectivity and critical seriousness. In sum, as Borges observed that humans and mirrors paradoxically multiply what we call the universe, neither Williams nor my reading of him were spared. Tonight I focus on the whole Williams in a single rebellion. The physician of human bodies and the metaphysician of modernist aesthetics. The maker of poetry monuments to the small, the ostensibly casual, the simply enjoyed, and the fragile as universal. The patriot of a still gestating America, and of course the narrator of his personal complexity as a Hispanic heritage American. Recently I viewed on PBS director Rick Tejada's documentary My Bolivia, Remembering What I Never Knew, on his inquiry into his Latin American roots. Watching Tejada travel through Bolivia, tracking down a history that he lost with the death of both parents, was evocative of Williams walking around Mayaguez, gathering material for Yes, Mrs. Williams. Ultimately, I would like to think that the Spanish-American roots finally presented Williams as his complete, complex self. For the beginning is assuredly the end, since we know nothing pure and simple beyond our own complexities. Patterson is a 5-volume expression of that complexity, the man no different than the city. But the beginning being assuredly the end, he had first encountered his complexity at the start of his career, as he reflected on a minimalist poem of 3 words. The found poem he came upon when choosing his writer's name, William Carlos Williams. He had grown up as Willie and then Bill, so why call attention to the exotic Carlos imposed on him to honor his mother's beloved physician, brother, which he never used? In the autobiography, he wrote that he chose the whole name because it was, quote, the most revealing, unquote, without detailing of what. From his work, we extrapolate that central between the more sexually even-tempered William and Williams was his joyously sexual and creative duende, the darker Carlos. In his novel Voyage to Pagany, he hammered the centrality of that Dionysian source by naming his protagonist, a representation of himself, Evan Dionysius Evans. In sum, to survive in a country that is really two, the imperfect implementation of its ideals and its idealized future flowering, Williams realized that he had to be 2 poets. Bill, as America wanted to know him, wrote in the American idiom, ostensibly, spontaneously, quote, straight ahead. Straight ahead, but crafted by Williams, who had grown up in a multilingual household, hearing wordplay natural to Spanish. That was the language of Carlos, the baroquely embedded voice of his devotion to his maternal muse, Elena, and a tribute to the inspiring Baroque poets his English father read to him in Spanish, Quevedo and Góngora. How could Bill's straightforward American idiom and Carlos's Baroque coexist? In poems like paintings, with symbolic balances of language usage as imagery. Not in every poem is the balance the same. Sometimes overt, other times subtle to the point of invisibility. Some poems with no identity handles at all can be like the poem with the punning title, Hymn, that's H-Y-M-N, Hymn to Love Ended, which would have nothing to do with identity or Spanish, but which seem to have nothing to do with identity or Spanish, but which invites the reader to suspect that it does, being subtitled Imaginary Translation from the Spanish. Then balance can come from his private acknowledgement of tributary. You didn't think that the Passaic River was just a river in Patterson. In other words, in his day, Williams intuitively knew that his America's pedigree only qualified him to be culturally discounted. This challenge he took on as his peculiar, quote, artist's weather, unquote, to confront not with self-marginalizing social consciousness, but with the elevating discourse of art. For this reason, only the whole Williams makes sense, his identity conflict as intrinsic to his literary achievement, and Al que Quiere is a masterful example. Its full title is actually a book of poems, Al que Quiere, as we discussed, a book of poems for whoever wants it, Williams, ever uncertain of what musicians comprised what he called my band. Yes, the title is ungrammatical to the dismay of his father. His concentration was on the symbolism, a balanced title in both English and Spanish to a collection of autobiographical poems for which he knew minds like that of Ezra Pound's would peg him as, quote, a foreigner, unquote. Defiantly, those poems celebrate his impure, because purely American life, as that of a poet with deeper American roots than Pound's, and empowered to take on the mainstream conversation, challenging the misperception that greatness can only come from Europe. When he answered the Paris Review in his last interview, I had no choice but to keep the Carlos. He was also declaring himself incapable of bartering for recognition, a pledge of allegiance to a mythic rewriting of history that only demoted him. He had read history. America, including this America, resulting from England's century-long aspiration to colonize, begins with Columbus's landing, with the sowing of the Spanish mingling spirit that the English and later Pound characterized as savage. That history made him American, not despite his Hispanic heritage, but because of it, giving him the more genuine credentials to write as a pure product of mingled America. Confident in his Americanness, he didn't need to prove his worthiness to retrograde America by rendering homage to a poetry that sought validation in English roots. He would be a poet of his time, picking up where Whitman left off, advocating for a modern poet from a truly American literary consciousness. Writing from that strength, he produced the now iconic poems that we can rediscover in this centennial edition of Al que Quiere. Thank you.
What a great evening. Great poetry and great ideas, comments. I'm going to close with a poem, but first I want to share with you how I got the idea to do this book. I saw New Direction's beautiful Centennial edition of Ezra Pound's book, Cathay. And I did the math very quickly, and it occurred to me that if Indy would do that, then it would simply have to do the Centennial edition of Al que Quiere. And the team agreed. This is the opening poem of Al que Quiere. He uses a Latin title because it sounded cool. He makes clear in the afterword that he was not a Latinist by any means. Sub terra, under the ground. Where shall I find you, you my grotesque fellows, that I seek everywhere to make up my band? None, not one with the earthy tastes I require. The burrowing pride that rises subtly as on a bush in May. Where are you this day? You, my 7-year locusts with cased wings. Ah, my beauties, how I long. That harvest, that shall be your advent, thrusting up through the grass, up under the weeds, answering me. That shall be satisfying. The light shall leap and snap that day as with 1,000,000 lashes. Oh, I have you. Yes, you are about me in a sense, playing under the blue pools that are my windows. But they shut you out still, there in the half-light. For the simple truth is that though I see you clear enough, you are not there. It is not that. It is you. You I want. God, if I could fathom the guts of shadows. You to come with me, poking into Negro houses with their gloom and smell. In among children, leaping around a dead dog, mimicking onto the lawns of the rich. You to go with me a tiptoe, head down under heaven, nostrils lipping the wind. Thank you once again for coming to our program.
And this is El Hombre, the man. It's a strange courage you bring me, ancient star. Shine alone in the sunrise, toward which you lend no part.